Greetings from the World Mission Communications Studio here on the campus of Asia Pacific Nazarene Theological Seminary. We are really excited to have Dr. Fletcher Tink with us today. Dr. Tink?
Thank you.
It's an honor. As I look at your resume, I am just amazed. Here you're serving currently as the director of the PhD program for transformational development. But yet I see 13 years as an adjunct professor at NTS and 11 years as director of the Brazil Institute for Metro Ministries. I have enjoyed your Facebook posts as you have literally traveled, I think more than, 34 nations teaching ethics.
56 nations.
56 nations teaching ethics and responsible business practices, theology of work. Amazing. Today we get to have you in studio as we're looking at urban church planting, the urban church. I have one little note here though. Tell me a little bit about this cutting loose haircuts around the world. What's this?
Well, I started about 12 years ago to do haircuts only outside of the United States. And so I have been able to measure the length of my hair by virtue of when I've been outside of the country. And so this was supposed to be completed in 50 countries. I'm now up to 77 countries writing this book, but it's really also a tale of why am I in the country, some of the cultural events that are related to being in that particular country, the assignments that I'm involved in. And I don't know when I'm going to stop. Only twice have I not taken a haircut outside of the United States, and they both happen to be for the weddings of my daughters in the United States. So,
wow, exciting. Well, that's not the only book you've written. You've written several, and we're just thrilled that you can be here, from prison services, ministry in Brazil, to church planting in Bolivia. You have quite a background in urban ministries, and so let's go ahead and get started with some questions.
Sure.
We'd like to ask today, why should we be concerned about the cities of today more than ever before?
Well, one of the reasons is, very frankly, the demographics of what's happening in the world. I've brought along, every year in January, there's a magazine or a journal called International Bulletin for Missionary Research. And in January, they produce a page of statistics. I use these in my classes. And it's called The Status of Global Christianity 2015. And when you go down there, there are some very, very fascinating statistics. For instance, in the year 1900, there were only 20 cities with a million population. Now there are, in 2015, 501 cities with a million population in the world. They project that to be 880 cities by the year 2050. There is a general move. Actually, it was about 5 years ago that over half the world's population was in identified cities. And so there is this urbanization of the world. It's very significant. The irony is that half of the people who live in the cities are considered poor. Half of the poor who live in the cities are living in shanty towns. And so when you look just at the statistics of it, it's really an amazing shift that's taking place. The growth of the cities is happening because of 4 different reasons. One is what we call internal migration. That is, for instance, in China, 30 million people a year move from the countryside, small towns, into the cities. This is the largest migration of people in the history of the world. And so China is becoming increasingly urbanized. But that same story, to a lesser degree, is taking place in many, many nations of the world. Second reason why urbanization is taking place is what we call external migration. That means that the more desirable nations of the world are places where people are moving from one country to another country. So in the United States, we've got a great deal of people coming in from the south, moving to Los Angeles, Houston, Texas, and so forth. So you've got international populations flowing from one place to another. If you're interested in missions, it becomes imperative for us to be able to identify that the mission is no longer over there, the mission is moved right into our own backyard. And so that's a part of it. Third reason is geographical expansion. Cities, as they become bigger and bigger, begin to swallow up all the communities around them. So that what was once independent little communities now are merely suburbs or totally absorbed by the cities. And so that's another form of expansion. The fourth, of course, is the growth of number of children that are born in cities. And in the West and in Europe and in Japan, those numbers have been reduced somewhat, but in the city people live a lot longer. And so the differential between when people die and the number of children that are born also increases. However, in the two-thirds world, you've got much larger families, and so there is that natural growth of births within the city. So those are the four major reasons why the cities are growing so very rapidly in this time and age. And what you're seeing is places like Brazil, for instance, 80% urbanized. Singapore, 100% urbanized. In fact, this term urban ministry is going to be very outdated 20 years from now when 70% of the world's population will be living in cities. That'll be the normative mission. We won't need to talk about urban ministries. So the demographics is one reason why it's important. If God cares for people, where are the people? The people are in the cities. And so that needs to be a focus. The second thing is that the city offers hope. You know, a lot of people disparage the city. They think life is violent, life is cruel. But when I've sent students out to do interviews with people on the street, why are you living in the city? Probably 70% of the responses are positive. We live in the city for a variety of reasons. One is educational possibilities, universities, colleges, and so forth. A second is the cities provide health care that may not be available in the countryside. Third is protection. That sounds a little ironic because you hear a lot about violence, but in a lot of countries in the world, the unrest is taking place out in the countryside where people are somewhat defensive. And the city at least has police forces and security that oftentimes does not exist outside of the cities. Another reason is jobs. People come moving into the city because there's the prospect for jobs or because there is the clientele for you to do something entrepreneurial, even though it's not a full-time job, but where you can make some money in some fashion. And so they move to the cities for that reason. Other reasons include entertainment. City gives you lots of entertainment possibilities. Another is, and this I think is quite significant, that the city provides critical masses for subcultures. In other words, let's just talk about one that's very much in discussion nowadays, that is the gay movement. In a rural environment, a few gay people don't really have an identity, they keep it hidden. But when they move into the city, a whole culture emerges, and they find themselves able to perpetuate that culture, create their own newspapers, magazines, create their own literature, their own organizations. And this happens at many subcultural ways. Another is anonymity. Lots of people come to the city because it allows them the opportunity of new starts. Anonymity means that they don't have to carry all the reputation, all the gossip, all the stereotyping that perhaps has ruined their opportunities in the countryside or small towns. Come to the city, people don't know who they are, and it gives them new starts. And then the last reason I put down here is social mobility. In the city, you find that people have the opportunity to move up socially and oftentimes move down socially. But the hope is that they move up socially And that happens much more quickly in the city than it might happen in another context.
We're talking about urban ministries. We're talking about the spiritual welfare of the cities. Is there scriptural context for this? Is there background in the Scripture that points us to doing city ministry?
Well, I think in the last 30 years, people have been mining the Scriptures to look at the urban focus of the Scriptures. And let me suggest some of the things. I mean, there's lots of ways in which I can go with this, but one is Bible starts in a garden, and the final image is in the eternal city. And so there is this movement from the garden to the city. A second one is that when Cain, of course, killed his brother Abel, in some sense, the first city that's mentioned in Scripture is the city of Enoch. And that was a city of refuge, really, for Cain that protected him. And so the city was, in some sense, a redemptive place for Cain. Another evidence within Scripture, of course, is the story of Babel. And it gives kind of the negative side of what the city means. Because what they tried to do was to institute a legal uniformity in that city and acquire the power of God. And some people have interpreted that the cities, in some sense, are cursed because we displace God, or we try to replace our own power mechanisms in place of God. And then, of course, the curse of God comes down, and what you find is this myriad of languages that, in some sense, is what happens in the city. And so the alternative, this I find very fascinating, the alternative, the reverse side of Babel, is what happened on the day of Pentecost. And on the day of Pentecost, you've got all the diversity, but because of the Spirit, they come together, and there's a unity that comes as a result of that. But both of these scenes are the two opposite sides of what the value of the city is. Another place that I'd direct you to, of course, is that Abraham was seeking a city whose builder and maker was God. He is a prototype of many of us who come to the city with a sense of hope and a desire to make something of our lives, and the city seems to be a measure or a means by which that can happen. Abraham was drawn by God to the city. Another is the cities of refuge. Interesting, we don't talk much about this within Scripture, but there were a number of cities that were places of redemption for people who had found themselves, for instance, accursed by manslaughter. They could escape to the city of refuge, be given new starts. And so in some sense, those cities were God's provision for new possibilities. Another is, Isaiah chapter 65, where it talks about the New Jerusalem, verses 17 to 25. It's an amazing description of the culture of the new city that God is creating. And there are particulars in there that suggest that there's health care, there is joy, there is long life, there is protection for children, there are people who are living by the works of their hands in houses, they've got jobs. That provides for us, I think, if that's the agenda of God, that should be the agenda that we find ourselves engaged in terms of the city. A couple more. Jeremiah, of course, talks about seek the peace of the city, because in that you will find your own shalom. Interesting verse. It does not say seek the peace of your church. It doesn't say seek the peace of your family, but seek the peace of the city, for in that city you will find your own shalom. And so I think there is an agenda there that we work as advocates in the city for the purpose of our own sense of satisfaction in working in favor of the redemptive purposes of Christ. Then Jesus weeps over the city. You see this picture as he looked over Jerusalem. He cares for the city. And then finally, Paul's ministry really was an urban ministry, and there are many examples as he goes to the heart of the city, in some sense to the jugular of Satan, to express the gospel. And I think these kinds of verses set up a norm for us to believe that the city is a very valid point or very valid locus for the activity of God in this world. And so those are some of the scriptural references that I would give.
You know, this is a very important topic, especially for us. Sitting here on the campus of APNTS, we're in one of Asia's largest megacities, in fact, one of the top 5. According to the United Nations report on the status of Asia-Pacific cities, they tell us that by 2030 we'll have grown from 17 megacities to 22, just here on the Asia-Pacific region. And they're telling us that the need is going to be tremendous. Talk to us about the needs of the city.
Well, I've already mentioned the fact that 50% of the urban peoples in the world live in poverty, and that 25%, or half of those living in poverty, live in shanty towns. Here in Manila, you've got great, beautiful condominiums, and right next to them, you got whole areas of shanty towns. Along the waterways, you got shanty towns, and where the quality of life is very risky in many ways. You can't avoid it. It's all over the place. Just outside of this campus, there are children running around here. And what I appreciate is that our students here at APNTS have gotten engaged in some of these communities around us, that they are putting legs to their theology. And it is changing their lives. And it's changing the lives of those that they're invested in. So poverty is one part of it. Another part of it is disillusionment. 2 days ago, I was reading an article on CNN, and it was really kind of shocking. This is the United States now. Apparently, for the first time, they are seeing that life expectancy among middle-aged white people is dropping.
I saw that, yeah.
It's not explained by medicine. Cancer rates are going down. Heart disease is going down. All the medical practices would suggest that we'd have longer lives. Why is it then that we're finding out that white, middle-aged Americans are dying at a much more frequent rate? This is a total shock and surprise to those who study these things.
I have that answer.
And it is?
And it is suicide and overdose and drugs.
Drugs, alcohol, and suicide.
Incredible, isn't it?
If those are the 3 reasons, I don't have to be a flaming preacher going around and talking about the meaninglessness of our society. But the materialism of Western society, the disconnect between the spiritual and the material, is such that, as Billy Graham says, there's a hole in the soul, and it's not being fed. And so this is one of the problems in the city. Another problem in the city is social confrontations. You've got movements in the city of, as I said before, these subcultural groups that are hostile to other subcultural groups. You've got people who resent other people. Some of it's tribal in the cities. Some of it is gangs in the cities and so forth. So you have criminal elements based upon the fact that people living in the city have difficulty living with each other. And in fact, in studies where they put rats inside cages and so forth, density is one of the means by which oftentimes there's violence. That's not always true. There are places in the world where there's very reduced violence, but especially in the West and in some of the emerging nations, you're finding that this problem of violence in the streets of the city between one group and another group is very serious, which brings into mind the fact that we have a responsibility as Christians to be people of reconciliation. And I'm not sure that pastors and Christian leaders really have defined the art of what it means, or the gifting of what it means to be agents of reconciliation between people groups that are outside of the church. Another is just the spirit of lostness. We've got lots of people walking around the streets who are lost. A number of years ago in the West, for instance, in the 1980s, under the policy of removing people from mental institutions and just giving them drugs, put them out on the street. They have no ability, many of them, no support systems that allow them to deal with the complexities of the city, but they wander around lost. And so that's another problem in the city. Another problem is the fracturing of relationships. The city gives us fabulous alternatives, and those alternatives oftentimes mean that the commitments that we have to marriage, to family life, to our historical grounded being, we've lost that, and people become very isolated in the city. And so we've got fractured relationships everywhere we go in the city. And part of the ministry, I think, of Christianity is to help bring together a healing in those relationships.
Absolutely.